Hello, my name is Derryck, and I am the founder and the president of Corbin Hill Food Project. And today I really want to thank Lindsay Smith from the local food work group in DC and the Bainham Family Fund for giving me this opportunity to continue a conversation we started several months ago. I'd like to cover three areas. First, to speak to the values that define Corbin Hill and how those values evolved, and to an extent, how these values are embedded in all of the discussions that we have today. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the transformation of the hybrid organization and how we have evolved over the last 8 years. And thirdly, I would like to be able to talk about the last mile delivery based upon a sovereignty framework. Let me summarize the slide in terms of our own impact. As you can see, we made progress from 2016, where we were working with 42 farmers, sold some 16,000 shares, and fed some 65,000 people in New York City. By 2017, we had actually changed our model, and we will talk about that a little later on, where we were now working with 200 farmers, sold some 34,000 farm shares that fed some 85,000 people. Despite this progress, it is really not the primary reason we exist. There was a deeper set of reasons. Among those reasons, you begin to understand the questions we were asking initially. Why do we exist? And for us, we answered that question in two ways: to reframe the narrative around food as it related to low-income folks, and to redefine the relationships between low-income communities and all the decision makers that are involved in the food system. We saw ourselves as playing that role in redefining relationships, and it required a new vocabulary, recognizing our communities were not economic citizens, but rather just consumers. Our communities were never involved in the design of any of its programs. And how do we measure success in reframing? We thought ourselves as being very successful in the early days by the scathing comments that were written about what we were trying to do as we created a new farm share. I remember distinctly Brooklyn Edible writing an article. The article was entitled "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly." Now, in many ways, I mean to say, I think I'm good and I think I'm bad. We never thought what we were doing was ugly. The other side of what we thought was very important was, in our first 2 years, was the fact that foundations began to have conversations with us. Two of them spent a day at my kitchen table, and one found a way to give us a grant, even though we were still a not-for-profit. As we were dealing with all of these, we had to talk about our values. And there are really three values that really stand out. One is food sovereignty, the second is shifting power, and racial equity. While in this chart I include community ownership, in fact it must be community driven, those are much more outcomes that we would like to see in terms of our particular values. The one comment I would like to make is around power for us at Corbin Hill. Power for us is about whose political interest is being served. Is it that of the farm worker, the farmer, or the low-income vulnerable populations? Politics is the use of power in a way that has very real effect on our lives. And our priority at Corbin Hill is clearly the interest of vulnerable populations. Who are we? And I think this is really an important question that we have to ask. And it begins essentially with our founders. Our 11 founders, 71% of the equity came from Blacks and Latinas and the Latinx community, 51% from women, and these help us define our values. We have a very interesting volunteer mix in terms of what we would find in our communities. Well, of the 48 volunteers, 45% are Black and 23% are Latinx. And that is a result of our own sovereignty approach, which we can discuss later. Racial equity for us is an intentional goal, and we have always achieved it at all levels. Who we serve and for whom do we work becomes another question. This is not an existential question, but it is one that others would attempt to answer for us with the assumption that they know and share our values and could therefore speak to us. And therefore, we find it very important that we define who we serve in terms of the populations we serve and the future populations we intend to serve. We remain a learning organization where farm share is an experience, not just a financial transaction. As a social enterprise, we are continually examining assumptions and knowledge. We are re-articulating theory to generate practice and practice to generate theory. We remain a very flexible organization. And for that reason, I'd like to be able to at least give you two examples of that kind of flexibility in terms of our aggregation history and in transportation. When we began in 2010, we had 4 farmers who came to the table wanting to work with us. The second year, we had 9. By 2014, we had 42 farmers working for us. And since we have changed our model, we now have today some 200 plus farmers. With growth came the pressure to invest in facilities, more trucks, more infrastructure development. And as a matter of fact, the farmers got together and put in an application to the state in which we were granted $350,000 in order to build part of that infrastructure. And Farm Credit East came to the table and also contributed $100,000. We in turn turned back the $350,000 granted by the state. We had to ask some really deep questions. Did we really want to go into debt and new guarantees that we would have to provide the bank for another $500,000? Or would we want to take those resources and be able to apply them in terms of working with communities and that we really thought would be the ones we should be serving? We turned down that grant and decided to take another path, which we will describe later. The same thing with transportation. In 2010, we owned our own truck. By 2010, 2012, we were leasing one. By 2013-14, we were contracting out. And today we own no trucks. We do not lease any trucks, and we do not contract out to any trucking services. We leverage the existing infrastructure that exists amongst others. And here we are at this particular point. Corbin Hill currently, how do we achieve our mission? Our core values remain the same. Our mission remains the same. We recognize the opportunity that there was a gap in infrastructure to support low-income communities. And we created this new strategy that says, work with supply chain partners to leverage existing food system infrastructure. And our goal, as defined, was to achieve equitable outcomes and increase access. Let me describe to you what it looked like in 2014. The complexity of just trucking. We had 4 different trucking companies. 2 were upstate, 2 were downstate. They were making 2 trips per week from upstate to downstate. And it was a true nightmare in terms of being able to get things to Brooklyn, being able to get things into Manhattan, being able to get things into the Bronx, and into Queens also. So having given up on that whole piece about trucking and aggregating, what does it look like now? In leveraging infrastructure, we're now working with 6 different aggregation and distribution groups that we call producer networks, who bring their own transportation, their own aggregation to us. We have 6 hubs. They do our aggregation, they supply refrigeration, and they provide transportation. And they give us access to some 200 farmers. Now, what does this look like in terms of the transformation of an organization? We are both an LLC and 501c3. If you noticed in 2010, we were doing at least 6 different functions, from community engagement to upstate and downstate transportation, to managing a farm, to farm share wholesale management, to distribution in the city, and to aggregation of communities. By going to our new model, we have now simplified what the LLC's function and role should be. It has to do with the land transfer and easement, it has to do with managing the farm, and it has to do with creating a revenue stream for the farm. Similarly, in terms of the 501c3, notice what it does now is it aggregates community, it aggregates the orders from those communities, it coordinates the distribution for those communities by leveraging the existing infrastructure. And to us, it's the way of operationalizing sovereignty. And what do we mean by operationalizing sovereignty? There are a number of things that we're talking about in terms of sovereignty, from sourcing from southern cooperatives, creating a platform for ordering, making sure that we have community ownership of the Corbin Hill farm, defining what we grow and eat and own. And as part of all of this, we will discuss in more detail last mile delivery. As is always the case, when you get a definition, you have to ask who created that definition and for what purpose. When we talk about last mile distribution, about the transportation from wholesale suppliers to consumers to point of sale, and that includes the modes of transportation, etc. What we're really talking about is the New York City food distribution and resiliency study that came after Sandy. If you take a look at those assumptions, you have to ask yourself who is included and who is not included, and what does it tell us and what does it not tell us. When we talk about refining the last mile delivery, what should be considered that's not in this definition? They never discuss the whole idea of a minimum cost for delivery that is unaffordable, that meet minimum orders of $250 to $350, if not a surcharge at $50 to $75. They do not discuss the size of the community being served. Thus, for instance, in Bed-Stuyvesant, 11 preschools exist in the 20-block area, but none of them can meet the minimum order. We also do not discuss the neighborhood in which the item is being delivered, because in addition to that $250 minimum order that they may have, there are all these tolls that they must incur if you're going to Staten Island or going to Brooklyn or going to Queens. And they do not include the smaller producers not meeting normal aggregation or collection terms. It is within this framework that you see new discussions being created around the concept of social hubs, the creation of micro hubs, and building community cohesiveness and resiliency that all include these particular communities if we do really address last mile delivery. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the dimensions of these sovereignty goals? What are we trying to achieve? First, community decision making. Secondly, utilizing existing community assets. Thirdly, economic benefits remain in the community. And we see the outcomes as being able to involving community wealth, shifting power, and racial equity. If we talk about who should own the last mile delivery, we define it in very specific terms. The assets exist and owned by entities in the community should include the trucks, the vans, the delivery cars, the refrigeration, the packing facilities, the ability to provide trained drivers and to provide training for drivers. It is part of what we view as an overall community-based fulfillment project. The other aspect of it is when we look at this whole new structure that we're trying to create, we must understand it must cross sectors within our community to create solutions. So that we're talking about traditional nonprofits, for-profits, sole proprietorships, a social enterprise, religious organizations. And it's important because when we talk about creating solutions and crossing sectors, we always talk about public-private partnerships, but it's very seldom framed within a community setting. The private sector, when it comes in to work with our community, is always from the outside. And that primarily that is because our communities are viewed as a non-profit economy, having very few assets. And that is not a reality if you really look closely in terms of what our community is. The second piece is that as we create this model, we ask ourselves, what are the risks, the benefits, and the sustainability of such a model? First of all, since these assets already exist in the community, no new capital is really required. Secondly, these are operating entities that bring their own expertise to the table. Thirdly, the new venture that we're talking about is the last mile delivery. The success of that is not essential to the continued success of any of these businesses that are involved in this partnership. And it brings existing assets into alliance. More importantly, for this entire relationship, it brings access to new markets. And how does it operate? Well, actually, we've been informally doing this for a number of years now with a borough president of Manhattan's office, where they have some 19 different senior sites, none of whom would meet the minimum of $250 as an order. And we have aggregated the orders from all of those sites and brought them to one anchor site that would be called the Dough Fund. There, the Dough Fund packs these things into bags. They're delivered and they're transported to the 19 sites. And by the way, those 19 sites are all within a 5-mile radius of the dough operation. And they're delivered to these 19 sites and then distributed at each of those particular sites. Over the past winter, we have also used a new anchor site, Riverside Church, as an anchor site church, And we've actually worked with 6 different sites where we aggregated the minimum orders from these 6 sites, repackaged for each site at the anchor site at Riverside Church. We used their refrigeration if needed, and then distributed to the sites within a 4-mile radius. We were able to reduce the minimum order from $250 to $150, and we generated some $9,000 of new revenues in terms of the small demonstration, which will be expanded this coming summer and the next winter. I think it's important that we define success in terms of while there's some 30 more questions we could add to this, I thought I would highlight just a few. How geographically diverse is the aggregation, and who benefits? We always must ask this question of who benefits. For example, do the benefits differ among different groups? Since this is an aggregation process, we know that there's going to be a social dimension to it, and for many groups who have, in terms of a gentrified community, they may be the ones who benefit the most by essentially being able to put together the small groups that come from their school, from their churches, or whatever the situation may be. As we look at the different models, we have to ask the question of financial feasibility of each model, and how scalable are each of these models. And we must ask ourselves in the long run, if this is to be replicated, what is the value of the assets being brought to the last mile delivery? And as a model, we have to look at all the issues that are involved, legal, there's insurance, and otherwise in bringing in these assets together. Together, this gives you a comprehensive sense of what we mean by last mile delivery that's embedded in a sovereignty framework. I wish to thank you all for this opportunity and being able to speak to the whole concept of a values-driven social enterprise and where sovereignty fits in terms of all of our decision, and particularly as it applies to last mile delivery. As part of a larger learning community, we hope that we can weave these ideas with many of the ideas that you have that can essentially change and reframe the language of how we address the needs of low-income communities.